welcome to Crime Bytes, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz, and today is True Crime Tuesday. Do I have any listeners who are hunters? I can't even kill insects, but I guess I can appreciate the sport of it, or hunting for food maybe. Kind of stalking and tracking something down just to destroy it, wiping it out of existence. For food, of course, or sport. I don't know. I'm not into killing or violence for someone who is this into the true crime community, but let me ask you guys another question. How many of you guys read this book when you were younger? I was obsessed with the Hardy Boys, and all these years later, this book in particular sticks with me. This one is called Deathgame, and I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it, but it touches on hunting. If this doesn't ring a bell, perhaps the short story, The Most Dangerous Game will. They both have pretty telling titles as is, but feel free to look them up if today's topic interests you, because while both of these stories are works of fiction, today's story is literally a real-life horror story that is very similar to these fictional works. And the topic at hand is hunting for humans. Human prey. This concept has kind of stuck with me since I picked up Deathgame in grade school. But before we get into that, let's pause for a quick promotion. Sandy Claus had a blast last week, and today I'm going to introduce you to Bobby Ebenezer. Here he is. Bobby Ebenezer Scrooge, but Bobby would like to be very clear that he is of no relation whatsoever to the Robert we are going to talk about in today's story. He does not support violence of any kind, except for when he occasionally throttles the old psycho eel with his candy cane that he calls his crabby cane from time to time. I mean, they definitely ask for it. Anyhow, Bobby is available for purchase on my Etsy shop. The link is in the description, and you can use the coupon code CRIME20. It's still active between now and New Year's to get 20% off your entire purchase. All right. Let's get back to today's story. And today's story is going to bring us to Alaska, which is literally a dream for hunters. It's the type of place you could very easily get lost in, which is horrifying to think about when you think about trying to find someone to save you from someone who is trying to hunt you down and kill you. And also precisely why today's killer chose this location. We are going to start our story in Anchorage, Alaska during the late 70s. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was being put in, and over 70,000 men traveled north to be a part of this. And with these men came industries to cater to them, such as bars, restaurants, strip clubs, and consequently, sex workers as well would start to establish themselves there. Anchorage would begin to develop quite the red light district. And 4th Avenue was home to the longest bar in the world, or a string of bars that were quickly becoming strip clubs with names like Wild Cherry, Booby Trap, and the Great Alaskan Bush Company. Great names there. A few of the girls in today's story would travel to Alaska to work in these clubs, and unfortunately it didn't turn out to be exactly the luxurious, high-paced life that sort of lured them there to begin with. But first, let's meet Detective Maxine Farrell. She was hired to the Anchorage PD in March of 1973. She would dress for work but bring jumpsuits with her in case she had to jump out of her car and get dirty for something like the crime scenes we're going to talk about today. At first, she worked at the counter and kept trying to get a job as an officer, but they wouldn't hire her because she was a woman. Then the Civil Rights Act came to pass, and they couldn't tell her that anymore, and she recalls that they went and picked the two quietest women working for them, herself and another female colleague, and hired them as officers. They figured that they were being hired because they would fail, so they showed up determined to prove them wrong. Isn't that wild? They literally had male colleagues tell them that they should be at home taking care of their kids. But they showed up meaning business, and eventually Maxine got promoted to homicide. One day, a young man came in to see Maxine to report his girlfriend missing. Sherry Morrow was an exotic dancer at the Wild Cherry Club. This club had quite the setup. They would advertise for dancers and then fly them up to Anchorage so that they could have this opportunity. And the girls would have to live in their housing units and dance at the club every day. They would incur debt like rent and their airfare because, yeah, that wasn't really free. And they would just have to keep on dancing to keep paying it down. Really a perfect setup for exploiting vulnerable women. It would take Susan, Sherry's roommate, 9 months to pay her debt down and leave Talents West, which was the dancing agency that hired the girls. Now, Susan would later recall that she walked Sherry to bring her to meet a man that she met at the club. She was propositioned by the same man the previous night, and he said he had a plane and a small cabin and was trying to get Susan to go there with him, but she had a bad feeling about it and decided not to. So she was a little worried about Sherry, but eventually Sherry still decided to go. She wanted to see if this was her kind of chance to get out of the lifestyle, but unfortunately, it would be the last time that Susan would ever see Sherry. She said she dropped her off and the man stared at her with like the coldest stare, and when Sherry turned back up, she ended up being so afraid that she got a flight out of Alaska and just left. She called the club where they worked and quit and reported Sherry missing, but only to the club and not the police. So this story wouldn't come out until a little bit later. Meanwhile, Maxine was sent to go look at some other remains that were found. The coroner would determine that the victim was stabbed to death. She was found in, and forgive me if I can't pronounce this one right, Eklutna, in a shallow grave, and she was partly eaten by the wildlife, never officially identified, and became known as Eklutna Annie. They believe that Eklutna Annie was involved in a similar lifestyle because of the clothing items that were found with her remains. And at this point, Maxine had about 7 missing girls on her desk, and they were all either sex workers or exotic dancers. And she started to feel like she was dealing with a serial killer, and she said so, and it ended up getting in the news, and it did not make her supervisors happy. They felt like she was going to put the entire community into an uproar, so they made her retract her statement, and they had her state that she thought the girls went missing all the time. These type of girls try not to make the community panic, but Maxine knew better, and she was not happy about this. Then on June 13th of 1983, 19-year-old Cindy Paulson was working on 4th Avenue. A car pulled up and she asked the driver if she could get some money for cigarettes. He kind of flashed a few larger bills in his wallet and told her he didn't have any change. So the two kind of moved from there to what they both really were there for, or thought they were both there for. Apparently they would agree to meet up, but the next day, and Cindy would sleep in, and so the meeting didn't happen until the next night when Cindy was back on 4th Avenue and the same car with the same man pulled up. He would want the same thing, which turned out to be oral sex in his car, and Cindy would agree to do this for $200. So she gets in and they drive away. After a little bit, they pull over and she begins to get to work, and he would start playing with her necklaces, which, okay, but then she was handcuffed. She would fight, but not much, because she said she could sense that he would do something really bad if she did, so she didn't fight too hard, and he drove her back to his place. He would drag her down to his basement, and he would rape her and sodomize her for hours on a bearskin rug. Then he would wrap a heavy chain around her neck and lay down and take a nap. When he woke up, he would tell her they were taking a little trip. He would dress her back up and cuff her back in his car, and they would take a small drive, and to Cindy's horror, they would pull up next to a small single-engine plane. They call them bush planes. I don't know why I like that. It's cool. He would tell her that he was taking her to spend some time with him in this isolated cabin in the woods. And after the time that she already had with him this far, Cindy wanted absolutely no part in this. At this point, she was pretty sure that he was not going to let her survive this little getaway. So when he was loading his bag into the plane, she somehow managed to get her cuffs loose and bolt for it. As she was sprinting towards Fifth Avenue, she saw a huge truck approaching and heard, "Stop, you bitch! Stop or I'll kill you!" behind her. And she never looked back. She just plowed forward towards those headlights and just prayed that the driver would stop, and he did. And he would bring Cindy to a motel because she didn't want to go to the police station, but he would not be able to resist calling the police himself after what he saw. And the officers would interview Cindy. They would drive with her out to where he found her, and she would see the plane, and they would take the till number and get the name Robert Hansen with an address on Old Harbor Road. And lo and behold, her description of the man who did this to her matched Robert Hansen perfectly. And when they went into his house, the description of the house matched her testimony perfectly, down to all the hunting trophies and bearskin rug in the basement. In addition, they found a hollow wall filled with various rifles and pistols, even though he claimed not to own any handguns. When he would be interviewed about what happened to Cindy, he would say that, "You can't rape a prostitute, can you?" Really, sir? It's just gross, and it says a lot right there. He gave an alibi, stating that he was at a friend's house till around 11, then another friend's house until around 5:30, after which he went to install a new seat in his plane. His friends would vouch for him, and it would become the word of 3 men who were considered upstanding citizens against the word of a prostitute. Maxine would only hear about Cindy's case after everything was said and done. She was really busy working the missing and murdered sex workers in her own department, which was a testament to how little the departments communicated back then. And things may have changed for the better since then because of issues like this. I'm not entirely positive. We may have some work to do still, though. You tell me. But Cindy's ordeal led us to a Robert Hansen. So, who was this Robert Hansen? Robert owned a bakery in downtown Anchorage. His wife, Darla, was a teacher, and they had 2 children together, a girl and a boy. He was originally from Pocahontas, Iowa. His parents were immigrants from Denmark named Chris and Edna, who owned a little bakery downtown. Robert was described as quite the loner with a stutter and acne by the people who knew him. His dad, Chris, was a little strict and was described as domineering. He would have Robert go to work with him at 2 a.m. every morning and then go to school afterwards overtired. He would get married at the age of 21, and at this point he would decide to burn down a local school bus garage, and his wife would leave him while he was serving 20 months in prison for this. He ended up attributing his wife leaving him more because he was too ugly and those internal issues that kind of haunted him from grade school, instead of it being because he burned down a building and he was incarcerated. He would remarry in 1963, and after a few years of trying to make things work in Iowa, the couple would move to Alaska in search of a fresh start. And they did. They started a family and became members of their community. Then in 1971, sex worker Patty Roberts would make a report about a man abducting and raping her. She would tell officers that he had a gun and my hands tied behind my back. He said if I shout, I would get beaten up. That same year, Susan Hepburn, real estate agent, would get a knock on her door and a man would ask her to use her phone. After that, they would chat for a little bit and nothing would really happen. Then the next day, he would come back really early in the morning and try to abduct her. When she screamed at the top of her lungs, he bolted and left his car behind. The responding officers were able to pick him up because of this and arrest him. And guess who it was? It was Robert Hansen. He would deny everything, of course, yet he left his car at the scene. He would be released on bail, but his photo would be taken and put in a perp book. Which, does anyone remember these books? They were literal like magazines before the internet took off, really, and slightly before after, because I used to doodle Christmas hats on the sodomy guys when I was in college. Anyhow, I guess it's not that funny, but I was way more young and innocent back then, and singing carols about sodomy made me chuckle instead of shiver like it kind of does now. I don't know. The memory still makes me giggle a little, even if it's kind of messed up. But they had in a perp book, and they would include crimes like rape and abduction in these books with pictures, because these are crimes that are more likely to be repeated. So watch out, basically. And because of this, about a month later, Patty Roberts would see Robert Hansen's photo in this perp book and identify him as the man who chained her up and raped her. They would arrest Robert, and he would deny it. He would claim that he did meet up with Patty, but she was falsifying claims because they didn't agree on the price. Sounds familiar. So in 1972, both of these cases would be brought before a judge who would tell Robert that he could get off completely free with his rape charge from Patty if he pleaded guilty to his assault with a deadly weapon charge from Susan, the real estate agent. And obviously he agreed, which, I'm sorry, it's sad. I know the tone about sex workers has gotten a little better, but I'm really sick of the this is what they signed up for, so this is what they get attitude when things like this happen, because so many of them get sucked into this lifestyle, and yes, it has risks associated with it, and it's not an easy lifestyle by any means. And I guess I should be a little careful how I put it, but no one deserves to be assaulted or put through something like that or of that nature that they don't consent to, even if they are doing it for work. Absolutely no one. But the law didn't really see things the same way in 1972, and poor Patty's case was regarded as garbage, and I'm sure as a result that's how she felt as well. He would receive a 5-year sentence and be paroled to a halfway house after less than a year for the charge against Susan. Hansen's wife suspected that he was seeing prostitutes. She would go to her church, which was somewhat a fundamentalist Christian church, and the vibe there was to keep the marriage together no matter what. And I'm sorry, but even in these Christian societies, I'm pretty sure adultery is usually considered the okay reason to leave someone, but in many cases, and even today, although maybe not quite as much, again, thankfully, this would be more directed to female adulterers, whereas males are kind of given a pass. And then in 1977, Robert was arrested for stealing a chainsaw, and he served 1 year of a 5-year sentence, the same as he got for the assault of a deadly weapon. He got for stealing a chainsaw. Make it make sense. Anyhow, a condition of the release this time was that he take lithium to control his bipolar disorder, but nothing was done to enforce this even while he was serving that year in prison. So I'm sorry, but why are we mandating things that we aren't enforcing? In 1981, he would open a bakery with $13,000 that he received from a fraudulent burglary claim. When investigated about this claim, he would claim that all of the stolen wildlife trophies were mysteriously found in his backyard. Please, sir. The next year he would buy his plane that he tried to abduct Cindy with. He would never obtain his pilot license, but he would use it to get himself to his remote cabin for his hunting expeditions. And in September of 1983, about a year after officers had found Sherry Morrow, a few hunters found the body of 17-year-old dancer Paula Goulding. She was near the Knik River as Sherry was, and there were shell casings in the grave just like there were with Sherry's. So Hansen was probably a rapist, and he was a family guy who liked to visit sex workers. But does that make him a serial killer? No one was making any headway on the bodies that were currently at hand, so Officer Greg Baker shared his information with the Alaska State Troopers who were heading the Topless Dancers Task Force, and they asked them if they had checked him out yet. Reality was closing in on them, and it appeared that Detective Maxine may have been right all along about her serial killer suspicions, because what Hansen essentially learned from his brush with the law in 1971 was that they didn't care as much about the sex workers as they did for the everyday woman. Now, that some people thought there might be a serial killer at hand, Maxine got excited and thought things would progress. She didn't get one person who told her that she was right all along. Surprise, surprise. Sergeant Glenn Flothe knew that Hansen was their man after he started connecting the reports together, the murdered women, the 1971 arrests, and the testimony from the Cindy Paulson case. I'd say at this point they had enough, but they still needed to get a warrant. And he ended up hearing about the work Maxine was doing on the case and went to ask her about it and ended up asking her to be on his task force, but her lieutenant would not let her. The audacity. So she puts it to his pride, and she's definitely right. She was devastated, but ended up handing over her files. Sergeant Flothe went back to visit another dancer who had made a report back in 1979. Christine Hayes recalls a man coming into her club and giving him a lap dance. A few nights later, she would see him outside of her club, and he would ask her if she wanted to buy some jewelry. She would follow him to his camper, where he would pull out a gun and hog tie her naked, but would not rape her. And he would start driving the camper. Christine would say that she prayed the Lord's Prayer and the wires around her hands and legs snapped. She would try and escape, and when Robert noticed, he would slam on his brakes and she would slam her face. She still has a scar to this day from it, and black out. She would come to as he was coming around the back of the camper, and she was able to open the little window that separated the camper from the cab and crawled through and just locked herself in the cab. He would punch through the driver's side window and she would bolt through the passenger side and just run naked until she got to a fence, and she just cleared it, barbed wire and all. And she likens it to just growing wings. She ended up in a lady's yard, bangs on her door, and this poor Jehovah's Witness older lady opens the door to see this bloody naked lady scaring that someone's gonna kill her. She was terrified, and the lady would tell her that Jehovah would protect them and call the police. And again, the attitude was that she was promiscuous. They actually told her it was because she was promiscuous, to which she responded, "Your job is to protect and serve." Then she demanded that they take her back to her club. 6 months later, he would walk into her club and she would call the police and end up getting in trouble for it at work, but they would show up and take the man's name. Guess who? Robert Hansen. And guess what his side of the story was? They had a fight about the money, and no charges were pressed, and the investigation was dropped. Christy was crushed and turned to drugs and alcohol, and although it's not an excuse, she did end up losing custody of her kids, having to give that to her mother. She became convinced that he was following her, and her neighbors told her a camper kept pulling up to her house and going and looking around, so she probably wasn't wrong, and one day her door was kicked in, but nothing was stolen. One time she even saw him and called the police, but this time they didn't even come. Sergeant Flothe also reopened Cindy's case and leaned in on Hansen's two friends, who he used as an alibi then, letting them know that they would be charged with perjury if it was discovered that they were giving a false alibi. And they cracked. They admitted that they were covering for Hansen so that he could avoid an embarrassing domestic situation. But obviously they were not looking to get into legal trouble, so they came clean. And after this, they were able to issue a search warrant for his house. This was significant because it set a legal precedent where psychological profiling was used as a primary source for issuing the warrant. I mean, I think we had plenty of evidence. It was all there, but it did set a precedent for using profiling, which is cool. When they searched his house, they found the gun that was used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. They would find jewelry from those victims along with others behind wooden paneling. They would also found a map with 20 X marks on them, and 4 of those matched the sites where they had found bodies. So there were 16 more places to search. Another significant detail of this case is that Robert is the only known serial killer to transport live victims by air, which is just so creepy. And everything about this case is creepy, but what I haven't really gone into yet is that he would fly his victims out to his cabin. He would assault them and set them free, typically naked. So they're set free, but in the remote wilderness. And then he would hunt them down like animals. He would give them a head start, so sometimes they'd have a few hours, but sometimes days of hope. Sometimes he would wound them and follow their blood trail, the poor girls just desperately trying to escape in an almost hopeful situation. Luckily, a couple of them did, but they escaped before he got them out to his real-life horror story. Hansen would initially deny everything, as he always did, but when he realized how much they had against him from their searches, he decided to confess. He would also help the investigators find some of the graves. He would plead guilty to 4 murders and admit to 13 others that he was not formally charged with. He showed absolutely no remorse, and the judge would sentence him to 461 years plus life without the possibility of parole. In 2014, he would die at the age of 75 in a hospital in Anchorage. He was moved in May of that year for medical attention and would pass away on August 21st of that year. There was a 2013 film made about Robert, starring Nicolas Cage as the detective hunting John Cusack as Robert Hansen. And I found this out while researching this case, and of course I put it right on. I love both actors and any movie based on true crime, and I enjoyed it a lot. I think they did a really great job, and I like how they did the hunting scene, although in real life, these poor women were sometimes attempting to escape from Robert for days. That part just gets me, not just minutes like in the scene. Can you even imagine? I'm not going to lie, this has been one of like those scenarios in my head, like, could I escape a killer that was hunting me? And I'd like to think in many cases, yes, wouldn't we all? But practically, he or she would probably get me in some of the other scenarios. Darn you, Deathgame. I've been thinking like this since elementary school. Would I make it? Does anyone else think like this or have like their own scenario? If you've got one, share it in the comments. Anyways, the movie took some cinematic liberties, but I think they did a great job with it overall. Before we go on, let me just list the names of Robert Hansen's known victims that we didn't mention in today's story and give them a moment, and I will leave a picture as well if I can find one. Roxanne Eastland, whose body was never found, Joanna Messina, Lisa Futrell, Audrey Altiery, whose body was also never found, Sue Luna, Malai Larsen, DeLynn Fay, Teresa Watson, Angela Feddern, Tamera Pederson, and there were 2 women whose identities were never determined, Eklutna Annie, who we mentioned already, and a second Jane Doe who became known as Horseshoe Harriet. May they rest in peace. And that's gonna do it, but as always, let's end today on a positive note, and let's bring back Detective Scoot Dog for that harsh truth, along with another one of those. Come here, Scooty. All right, we got Scoot. We got Detective Scoot Dog. And this week's hard truth is so simple. You are not better than anyone, so stop thinking you are. That's for everyone. Scooter is though, so don't mess with him. Okay, and with that in mind, today's positive highlight is another update. Remember Pastor J.P. Miller? Another upstanding man who turned out to be literally the worst of the worst. I have good news and bad news, and the good news is that he has finally been arrested. Hey, you want another bacon? The bad news is that it's not for being involved with murdering Micah. It's actually an interesting one, and I'm not even sure if he should have been arrested, but the saying goes, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. That's some gold right there, all you stupid players, because of all the controversy surrounding Micah Miller's death, which is still officially ruled as a suicide. His church has a group of protesters who stand outside with signs demanding justice for Micah. And I'll play this video for you here.
Uh-oh, y'all. What's going on? JP just touched that. JP just touched that girl. Oh my God, y'all.
You can see the protester up in his face, and apparently he raises his phone in her face and taps her on the cap, and you can kind of see that. And she starts running at him screaming, "Don't touch me, don't touch me." And witnesses would state that he struck her twice, but this is not in the video, and it's unclear if he did actually touch her. So he was arrested and then released on bond, so I'm not sure if this is going to help or hurt the case, honestly. But there's more J.P. Miller news in the news, so who knows? At least they're still on him. Just a few days prior, on November 1st, the FBI raided his house, and a spokesperson would say that they can only confirm that their presence is related to court-authorized law enforcement activity. But reportedly they had gloves and evidence bags, but there have not been any notable results beyond that thus far. So we'll see. It could be connected to his financial shenanigans, but it could also be connected to Micah's death, so stay posted. We can only hope that eventually justice will actually be found for Micah. And before I go off on another rant on just straight evil people exploiting religious or good people the way that JP does, let me just end there. I'll leave that link to the Micah Miller video I did if you want to catch up on that case. And until next week, please stay safe out there. Bye.